All right, so yes, thanks everyone for coming this morning to this webinar about decarbonisation efforts, and in particular using offsets to achieve some of the global goals that we've set for us. So what I'm going to do is just go through a couple of slides around framing and sort of the size of the challenge, and then we're going to be talking with Bill Bezos from Air Carbon about the use of offsets. He's going to say a few words up the start of this, just after my slides, and then we're going to have a conversation about what are offsets, where can we use them, where do we see the future of the offset market going. So I'll get into firstly some of the upfront slides. So there we go. So what I did was just put together a few slides around what is the impact right now of COVID-19 on greenhouse gas emissions globally, and what sort of things are we likely to see going forward. So we have seen a drop in manufacturing emissions, largely due to low demand. A lot of manufacturing places being shut down, heavy industry, steel, cement, etc., has been decreased over time. Huge decrease in air traffic volume, massive, like over 90% in passenger and cargo, which then goes into obviously a pretty large reduction in emissions. The aviation industry as a whole responsible for about 2.5% of global emissions. We've seen a reduction in vehicle use, largely due to people locked down and much reduced personal vehicle movement. We can see that here in Singapore also. And what that means in terms of oil production is there's been a huge reduction in oil demand. And that's seen some of the huge swings in the oil price that we've seen of late. So really big reduction in demand over time, and just this year, and we'll see what happens sort of going forward as we come out of this crisis. And then finally, reductions in power use by a lot of manufacturing and commercial buildings, obviously not using as much power because there's nobody in them. There is a trade-off though between commercial and residential, which means that because people are at home, you're now sort of pushing that power use onto residential use rather than commercial use. Overall trend is downwards though, about 8%. And we have seen the impact in the merit order. Renewables obviously are able to, well, they will just produce energy. So we've seen them sort of maintain and even increase their usage over time, while we've seen coal and gas drop off. Gas has sort of appeared lower in the merit order than coal now because the gas price has dropped more than the coal price. Anyway, so moving on, what we were going to see, 2020 was probably going to be an increase in emissions. At best, it would be a plateau in emissions globally, following on recent trends. So year on year, emissions have been increasing pretty much. And then current estimates by the Global Carbon Project say they're estimating about a 5% reduction. The IEA report that just came out last week is estimating about an 8% drop in emissions, which is the largest drop in emissions ever recorded, right? But it does come at this huge economic cost. So I'm not really advocating sort of global pandemic as a way to reduce emissions. I don't think that's appropriate. Millions of people out of work, hundreds of thousands of people have died. But this has seen a huge reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over time. There's a little graph that shows what has happened since pre-industrial times. Now, where to? Typically, after an economic shock, there has been a recovery in emissions, and there's been continued growth in emissions over that time. And this graph over here on the left just shows where emissions have gone after a drop, how they've increased back up again at even a faster rate than they were before. The economic recovery with this particular crisis might actually be longer because it's a bigger drop in economic output. And the growth in emissions should be a little bit slower due to ongoing decoupling of emissions and GDP. But reduction in the rate of growth of emissions is not really what we're looking for. We actually need reduction in absolute emissions to achieve the goals that we've set under the Paris Agreement. What this graph here shows is basically highlighting the gap to the target. And you can see the blue line shows with current policies in place what it was going to be, how many emissions we were going to have out to 2030. The red line, if everyone who's committed to doing something and having new policy under the Paris Agreement implements that policy, where emissions will be. and then where they need to be in this sort of lighter aqua line and the green line to achieve 2 degrees temperature rise or 1.5 degrees temperature rise, which are the goals. So there's still a big gap to target. If I overlay what's happened with COVID-19, you can see there's been a drop in 2020, but then if we increase emissions at the same rate we did before, then the current policy still drops down a little bit to where it otherwise would be. With unconditional NDCs, you can see perhaps a bending of that line, more emissions reductions, but still quite a sizable gap to the 2 degree range and to the 1.5 degree range. Bearing in mind, we've seen somewhere between a 5 to 8% drop in emissions as a result of COVID-19 and as a result of economic slowdown. But to achieve 1.5, we need about 7.5% per year, year on year, every year until 2050 to achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves. So that's difficult. Now, how are we going to get there is the question. There's really two main ways we can look at this. One, if you look at abatement, so this is reducing emissions within a company boundary, doing something that reduces what's called scope 1 emissions, direct emissions. That does reduce carbon liability, does cost money though, but this is a known future cost. So the cost of installing CCS or the cost of installing renewables or energy efficiency or fuel switching is a known cost that locks that cost in place. The other option is offsets. So doing emissions reduction outside of company boundaries. So either being a project proponent and doing an emissions reduction somewhere else, or paying someone for doing their project somewhere else and buying offsets from it. So could be net from your emissions total, depends on what the compliance regime is, may not necessarily reduce your own carbon liability. Sorts of things we're looking at are forestry projects, that's land use change, forestry, renewable energy that isn't for your own use, refrigerant management, landfill gas, fuel switching, etc. What we're actually going for, or what makes most sense economically, is to take the least cost abatement option. So we're looking at, for a company, what's best, doing your own emissions abatement and reducing your own emissions, or purchasing offsets. So Bill, this is actually my segue now to go into what Bill is talking about, which is the use of offsets and the role of offsets in this. So I'll quickly stop sharing my screen and you can see me. And then I'll hand over to Bill so he can talk about what offset projects are and what these all mean.
Okay, thanks, Mark. That's really interesting. I actually have a lot of notes that I'm working off of, and I've actually included in them some figures and numbers that I'm happy to share with you afterwards. I guess C's will organize that, but it's about 3 pages or so of the work that I've put into this. I think the first thing that we need to differentiate, and we sort of, Mark and I had talked back and forth about how it was that we would sort of address this, and we want to make it maybe a little basic for some of the people that are here, but the idea is to give you sort of a comprehensive understanding of what we see as carbon offsets, what they are, and where we're going in terms of the carbon offset business. So the first differentiation that we need to make is the differentiation between allowances and carbon credits, because they seem to be jumbled up into one conversation. Here we're talking about carbon credits, but allowances, for example, people are talking about, you know, the allowance, the price of allowances is 20 euros. The price of carbon credits is 20 euros. Well, that's actually not true. The price of EU allowances are currently hovering around 19, 20 euros on either side of that number. An allowance is effectively a permit to emit. So a government stipulates a cap and issues to the industry in particular a set amount of allowances, which are denominated in tons of carbon. And if they emit less than the total allowances that they have, they can sell them in the market. And the way an allowance market works is that on an annual basis or on a phase by phase basis, that cap gets pushed down and pushed down. And as the different industries have to replace their aging infrastructure, as the cap is being pushed down, that infrastructure will be replaced with cleaner infrastructure, so that it doesn't attract allowances. So that's the concept behind the allowance business. The offsets, which Mark touched on, are completely different. They're not actually a permit. The similarity is that they're both denominated in tons of carbon, but it probably ends there. A carbon credit basically is created. It represents an actual mitigation of carbon. So you look at business as usual, and you enter into an activity. In other words, and I'll touch on it in a little while. You enter into an activity that creates the same output, but at a reduced emission. So if the baseline in a country is to use coal-fired power plants, and you are one of the first to put up wind power, for example, then you get carbon credits because of the difficulties of putting up this project. And so it's the difference between the emissions per megawatt of coal and wind is denominated in tons of carbon, which create the carbon credits. There are several registries that have cropped up around the world. I guess the first one was the Clean Development Mechanism, which was set up by the UN, and this was the sort of the offshoot of the Kyoto Protocol and the beginnings of sort of the carbon markets. On the heels of that, and because of the difficulty around, well, to be honest, I mean, CDM is somewhat tone deaf when it comes to facilitating business. So it's a bit of an anomaly in itself, because it's a generator of carbon credits, but at the same time, it's not. It doesn't promote business very easily. It's very difficult to transfer carbon credits from a buyer to a seller using the CDM process. And so we saw, as a result of that, the creation of some other registries around the world. And I honestly thought that I knew all the different registries until the ICAO asked for, there was a request for registries to come forth and participate in the carbon offset scheme that's being set up by the aviation industry, and 14 of them actually applied. 6 eventually have been approved for the first phase, but I was surprised to see that there were actually 14. Of those 14, there really 3 of them are sort of front and center. CDM we've talked about. Vera is a sort of market-based initiative that's headquartered out of Washington, D.C. And the third one is Gold Standard, which is a registry that was put together by several NGOs. And I guess it's appropriately called Gold Standard because it is the most sort of rigorous registry out there. The markets themselves, and Mark, you can jump in at any time. The markets themselves are divided into sort of compliance and voluntary markets. The largest compliance market we touched on initially with the allowance conversation is the EU ETS. So it covers, their cap is about 1.8 billion metric tons of carbon. That was in 2019, and the average price was 18 euros. The voluntary market is significantly smaller. You're talking about just around 100 million metric tons traded. total market cap of somewhere around 300 to 400 million, depending on who you speak to. But it has been increasing exponentially. I mean, since 2016, you've seen growths of 50% on a year-on-year basis. So it's growing and growing substantially. The lion's share of carbon credits are actually finding a home in the voluntary market, and that reflects the fact that a lot of the pricing in the carbon markets, in the carbon credit markets, are significantly lower than the allowance markets. Korea is probably, the Korean emission trading scheme is actually potentially one of the few out there that's allowing for the bleeding in of carbon credits into their emission trading scheme. But I think this, I think it'll be changing. Let's see, what else can we talk about? Mark was asking me, he said, I think we should talk about what constitutes a good credit, right?
Yes.
And that's something that's a bit of that's sort of a point of contention amongst a lot of people in the carbon markets. You'll hear things about additionality and fungibility and the project types and monitoring verifications. But in my mind, sort of what constitutes a good carbon credit is really additionality, permanence, and if you can actually monitor, measure, and verify the darn thing. So that's in terms of additionality, it's really a very simple question. In the absence of getting carbon credits for doing a carbon mitigating activity, would this project come to fruition? So if the answer is no, then your project is not additional. Now, it's a slippery slope, and there are some very smart people out there that have looked for additionality outside of just the economics question. And so it depends on how strict you want to be in your interpretation. But I think I sort of tend to err on the side of gold standard over the side of CDM in terms of additionality. The other one is permanence, and that's a very interesting concept, in that if you're going to get a carbon credit for doing a certain mitigating activity, is that mitigating activity a permanent reduction? And that can, I guess the best example of that is giving carbon credits to someone that promises to not cut down a forest, and then 3 years later they do. So the mitigation effort was actually not a permanent mitigation effort. And then the last one is, you might be able to actually find a project that's additional. You might be able to actually put a project that is permanent in the sense of the carbon credit existing, but you may not be able to monitor and measure and actually verify. There are these cook stove projects out there where cook stoves are being, people in very poor areas tend to use open fires to cook, and there are carbon projects out there that go out and give these people very highly efficient cook stoves. And it's the difference in emissions between those cook stoves and the open fire that generate the savings in carbon. And it's that carbon credit from that activity that's then sold onto the market that finances the underlying cook stoves. Well, the biggest problem of that project is actually the monitoring of it, because you're talking about 100,000, 200,000 cook stoves, and you need to do sampling in order to find out if the cook stoves there are there after a year, 2 years, or 5 years, etc. So verification is actually a very key part of it. In terms of types of projects, I think one of the things that's worth pointing out is that, we're talking about greenhouse gases here. And all of them are being, we sort of lump it into this idea of carbon and carbon credits, but we're really talking about a series of different gases, and every single one has a different global warming potential. The global warming potential really is, how it has to do with the mass of the underlying molecules and how long they sit in the atmosphere. So the carbon dioxide is considered to have a global warming potential of 1, and so that's the baseline for calculating the global warming potential of all the other gases. But for example, over a 20-year period, nitrous oxide has 264 global warming potential. So it's 264 times worse for the environment effectively than carbon dioxide. So if you were to find a project where you are mitigating the emissions of nitrous oxide, for every ton of nitrous oxide you mitigate, you would get 264 carbon credits. So those projects are very highly sought after. Those are the industrial type projects that are out there, and they're few and far between, and they have a certain stigma because they tend to be very profitable because of the global warming potential ratios, and also because they're very controllable. They're in a reduced space, and it's very sort of simple to, there's one stakeholder that's usually involved, and so everything is very contained and it's very easy to do. The problem with this is the profitability of it goes in the face of additionality, and there's a lot of sort of pushback on these types of industrial projects. The other ones are agricultural. Those are sort of, I guess the best way to talk about them is as an example, those around us. There are methane capture projects. So if you have what are they called? Palm oil mills. Palm oil mills have an effluent that comes out, and they leave into these lagoons, and they fester, and the methane then goes into the atmosphere. Methane, according to the Kyoto, according to CDM, but in general, is about 21 times global warming potential of carbon. So for every ton of methane that you capture from these lagoons in palm oil industries, you get 20 carbon credits. So potentially, again, very profitable, and it's an interesting regional play for Southeast Asia, given the prevalence of palm oil mills in the region. Energy efficiency is another one. I mean, if you're using, if there's any way that you can reduce the amount of energy that a building uses or an industry uses, that then reduces the amount of power. Power has is produced usually by fossil fuels, and so you're able to calculate the savings on a per megawatt basis. And then the last one, which is a project type that Mark alluded to, and I'm getting to know a little bit more, but I've always had an issue with because of the permanence issue that we talked about earlier. Those are the nature-based solutions. Those are basically forests where forest or nature-based carbon sinks, if you will, where someone's basically saying, look, here's this stock of carbon in the form of trees or peatland or whatever it is, and we will promise no longer to save it. And you look at what the degree of deforestation is in the absence of the activity, and that tells you how long that project or how much carbon that project is actually saving on an annual basis. So those are the sort of very quickly the types of projects that are out there.
Cool. Thanks very much for that really good description, Bill. There's certainly a lot of different types of projects out there and a lot of different sort of ways to generate credits and then purchase credits. Maybe if we can just change tack a little bit and we talk about what is the future of carbon credits. So with the airline industry working with CORSIA now, as of sort of next year is the starting time. And then with a lot of big companies like Shell and Total and BP and big oil and gas companies making some pretty big commitments around purchasing carbon credits. What do you see as the future of the credit market?
Well, I think it's absolutely certain that we're moving into a carbon constrained world. That's definitely that's definitely in the mix, and it's pretty obvious. You pick up the paper any day and you see just, you know, how many, there's at least one or two companies almost on a daily basis announcing that that they're ready to reduce emissions, that they're going carbon neutral, carbon negative. So that's that I have very little doubt that that's actually going to happen. The issue with CORSIA effectively, and just to give people a little bit of background, ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization. It's actually a part of the UN, even though it precedes it in terms of its age. And they came up with this thing called CORSIA, which is the Carbon Offset and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. The first phase of CORSIA is 2021 to 2023. The idea of CORSIA is to cap 2050 emissions to 2020 levels. So what CORSIA addresses is actually the growth of emissions in the aviation industry, not the base emissions. So
I suppose just to jump in real quick, sorry, Bill, but
yeah.
2020 emissions are going to be very low for the aviation industry since nobody's flown a plane for the last 2.5 months.
Well, that's the baseline is 2019, 2020 for the first phase. And so that brings a pretty interesting sort of dynamic, because if you include 2020 to generate the baseline, then any growth from this point onwards, from the end of 2020 onwards, would be attributable to phase one. And it really depends on how quickly the airline industry goes back to the levels of growth that it was before the COVID situation. But the idea in the market is that the first phase, the demand on first phase of CORSIA would be about 78 million tons of carbon. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the entire universe based on the amount of the registries that have been approved and the types of carbon credits that are approved for the first phase of CORSIA, the numbers that we're hearing is about there's 350 million tons available for the first phase. So that means that, you know, even in a normal scenario, that 78 million tons would generate a market, but not, it would be oversupplied effectively. So the price of a CORSIA credit, in my mind, was likely to be significantly sort of in the low single digits type of range. Now, there's a big push by the airlines and IATA to drop 2020 from the baseline. So if they use the 2019 baseline only, and the industry, remember this is only 21 to 23, and the industry doesn't sort of grow quickly out of the doldrums, effective demand for CORSIA on most scenarios that I've seen there are, you know, 0 to half of the actual demand that was requested. So this push by the airlines to use 2019 and exclude 2020 is going to have a huge impact on demand from CORSIA and may actually wipe it out completely for phase one. The larger companies are still going to be there. I think there's we have we have Mother Nature on our side now, which is important. You know, she's definitely upset, and we see it in, you know, fires in Australia and floods and all this. So I don't think companies can ignore climate change any longer, and offsets seem to be the way.
True. Although, you know, given history coming out of different crises that we've had over time, sometimes climate change just gets pushed back a couple of years. Just happened in coming out of global financial crisis. Just like, oh, we need to let the economy recover before we get stuck into this. So I do, you know, harbor some fears that may happen, but we'll see. We'll see. Climate change is not going away. You're absolutely correct, and
Yeah.
physics won't argue with it. So I suppose on that, and thinking about sort of the international framework around climate change, which is, you know, the Paris agreements, and in there carbon markets play a role in Article 6. Do you have any thoughts around there? And I will then give everyone my thoughts around around that as well, and what might happen.
Yeah, I think you're probably more well versed in this. I mean, my big issue is that 196, expecting 196 countries to come to a unanimous decision is extremely difficult. So I honestly think that I'm very I don't think Article 6 is going to be solved within the next year. I think the issues are too well ingrained. If I had to say something to sort of people in government, is that they need to focus their efforts on using market forces to engender sort of carbon mitigating activities. If they focus on that, you know, a lot of these other more intrusive things where governments are buying carbon credits and stuff, they're just crowding out private capital. I think that's sort of the only thing that I would mention. But I'm more interested in getting your take on this and what you think about this whole ITMOs and all this other business.
Well, I suppose for everyone's benefit, Article 6 sets up market-based and non-market-based mechanisms under the Paris Agreement, so that countries can actually trade mitigation obligations between each other, and sets up sort of a carbon market, so to speak. But there's been a couple of pretty entrenched positions by some countries, and there's still some arguments about, certainly around the potential for double counting. So if you sell a carbon credit to someone, do you then get to use it as one of your domestic reductions as well? I would have thought the answer is no, but some countries don't think so. And actually the use of credits from Kyoto time, so the use of additional CDM credits that they may have generated, or the ability to carry over authorized allowance units from, you know, overachieving in Kyoto. So yeah, they're pretty entrenched positions. I'm not sure what the way out is going to be. I will say, you don't, in my mind, don't necessarily need Article 6 there to actually set up a carbon trading scheme within a country or within a region. You know, that's entirely possible. There's many examples of that so far. So maybe it's time for sort of all these regional things to come to the fore. Certainly agree that market-based mechanisms provide an economically efficient way to reduce emissions. So anyway, now we'll see if we can open up to questions from everyone else. So don't forget, there's a chat bar. I don't know, Tom, you want to explain the raise hand bit as well, if anyone wants to say something and actually get on the call to ask a question. I've only seen the one question so far from Sanjay. Hi, Sanjay. And that's, do I have some Singapore numbers to share? The answer is yes. I do have Singapore numbers. I didn't share them. And I've certainly got numbers around the enhanced targets for Singapore, as well as the low emissions development strategy and where we're actually headed as a nation. So there's some, but so a question from Christoph, and this is, I will say, Sanjay, if you want stuff, then we can send stuff via Seas or something. We'll get information to you if you need. So a question from Christoph, how do you reconcile carbon credits and RECs? What should companies focus on? and maybe treat this both from a company that can generate credits as well as a company that might want to use credits.
Are you asking me?
I'm asking you, yes.
Okay. The way I look at it is it's just a pricing thing. I mean, if there's an active REC market, these are projects have environmental benefits, and their carbon credits are one, and RECs are others. If there is an active REC market and the pricing is attractive, then you pick that route. And if the carbon markets are attractive, and then you pick the other one. India was an interesting example. There was, they announced a REC market. This is several years ago, but there was no enforcement. So even though there was a market and everything was great, and there was just no enforcement. So companies had no incentive to buy RECs, and so the actual price of RECs was near zero. The auctions got very little attention. So in that case, a wind power project in India really looked at the carbon markets and not so much at the REC markets. So I think that's it's really a case by case basis.
Yeah, I'll certainly agree with that. And I think the two markets are complementary, and it depends, I suppose, on what the focus of the nation is, whether it's to promote renewable energy as a key focus or reduce emissions. Obviously it does both, but the markets will be set up differently, and really it's incumbent on the project proponent, I suppose, to figure out what's best. So come up with a view on what the future of carbon credits is going to be, or come up with a view on what the future of RECs is going to be, given the policy landscapes in both of those situations, and then just make a decision which one's best. You can't do both, because then you're breaking the additionality rules.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Sure, Amy.
Yes.
Hi. Well, this is Amy from Gaia Environment. Well, I think we have to look at the users' position to define the difference from carbon offsets and RECs, because RECs only can be used for scope 1 and scope 2 emission, the electricity you're using, but carbon offsets can be used as scope 3, so it cannot be replaced in some cases. So only the RECs is only for the electricity, but carbon you can use for other, in the different emission.
Absolutely correct. And I think that's a good point. So it's really all about whether you're a user of RECs or a project proponent of RECs or carbon credits, is deciding as a company what's best and what your overall goals are, and actually framing it as in, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve a reduction in scope 3 emissions, for example?
Yeah.
In which case, absolutely, carbon credits are the things to use.
They're both, they both do the same thing. They both transfer capital from one polluting activity to a non-polluting activity.
Yeah, but the rest is only for the electricity. You cannot use for the offset for transport, for the the other emission.
Correct.
Yeah,
that's true.
And and also important is the users have to decide which to use based on what initiative you are following. If you're following like CDP or you're following RE100, the acceptable instruments, either carbon or RECs, are totally different. So you have to look at what initiative you are following.
Yep. Okay. Well, thanks for your comments. And yes, absolutely agree with you. So I'll just move on. The questions come in from Munway. I was looking at the gold standard certification process and fees for some renewable energy projects. The process is tedious and the fees are complex and multi-layered. Do you think this should be made more market friendly in the future? This is absolutely a question for you, Bill.
The answer is yes, but you have to look at the origins of gold standard, right? So these are NGOs that got together and were very, very concerned with the integrity of the underlying credits that were being created in light of CDM being somewhat swashbuckling in terms of getting their credits and projects registered. So they are a very sort of rigorous in their approach regardless. But I agree with you, the process is tedious and the fees are actually, I'm not 100% convinced that paying the extra fees for gold standard are actually worth it. You know, you can get carbon credits that are pretty robust without that compete with gold standard, and, you know, less onerous. But yeah, I agree with you. They can do better.
It's good comments. Thank you, Bill. So I think we've pretty much come close to the end of time. Is that right, Tom?
Yep, that's right.
Since we started at 5 past. Okay, cool. So did you want to close out, or Kavita? Someone can.
No, I mean, we can still, if there are any last burning questions, we can still let people ask. We have a lot of carbon market experts here in the audience as well. Let's give them another few seconds. If there are no questions, then I guess then it's just left for me to thank both Mark and Bill for coming on today for this webinar. And this is just the beginning. I suppose we'll keep these conversations going, and please stay tuned for more discussions on the carbon markets and all the other aspects of the sustainable energy industry as well. Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank
and
you.
Again, if anybody wants a copy of my notes, I'm happy to give it through CES.
Sure, we'll share the slides if it's okay, and the notes with the speakers.
Sure.
We'll share it with all our participants today.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, once again, and stay tuned for our next webinar on coming Monday, and we'll send you more information through on that as well. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.